I stood in the bustling main hall of Franklin High School, the venue for the district-wide debate finals. The harsh white lights overhead cast a sterile glow on the crowd of students and parents scrambling for seats, while the speakers crackled with muffled announcements about the order of speakers. At 17, a junior at this underfunded public school in the city's rundown suburbs, I, Amara Lewis, felt like an island in a sea of privilege. My simple white blouse and black skirt were neat but worn, my hair neatly braided back, and in my hands, I clutched an old, dog-eared notebook filled with handwritten notes. As the only representative from my grade, and the sole kid from our impoverished neighborhood, I sensed the isolation acutely. While other contestants were surrounded by teachers patting their backs and whispering encouragements, I kept my head down, reviewing my speech one last time. My heart pounded, echoing the sleepless nights I'd spent practicing under the dim yellow bulb in our cramped apartment, where Mom worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. The air was thick with anticipation, mixed with the faint scent of coffee from the judge's table and the polished leather of expensive bags carried by families from wealthier districts. I positioned myself near the registration desk, trying to blend in, but I knew I stuck out. Franklin High wasn't known for winning these things. We were the school with free lunch programs and leaky roofs, not the one with debate coaches flown in from Ivy League prep programs. Still, I'd earned my spot here through sheer grit, poring over library books and online articles late into the night, honing arguments that cut like knives. This wasn't just a competition for me, it was a chance to prove that voices like mine mattered, even if they came from the wrong side of the tracks. Suddenly, the doors swung open with a whoosh, and in strode a group of students from Gates Academy, the elite private school across town. Their uniforms were crisp and tailored, badges gleaming under the lights, and their laughter rang out sharp and confident, carrying the subtle aroma of high-end cologne and entitlement. They moved like they owned the place, scanning the room with casual disdain. My stomach tightened as their eyes landed on me, the small black girl standing alone by the desk, notebook in hand. One of them, a tall blonde with perfectly styled hair, paused and tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over me from head to toe. The others followed suit, their chatter dying down to whispers. I could feel the shift, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to break. This was it, the collision I'd half expected but hoped to avoid. Claire paused right in front of me, her blue eyes narrowing as she scanned me from my braided hair down to my scuffed black shoes. The group from Gates Academy clustered behind her, forming a wall of smug expressions and crossed arms. She flipped her golden locks over one shoulder, her voice slicing through the hum of the hall like a sharpened blade, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Oh, you're a contestant? We thought this was a debate competition, not an audition for some documentary on underdeveloped neighborhoods." The words hit like a slap, but it was the laughter that followed that burned deepest. Her friends erupted in giggles, one boy with slicked back hair chiming in, his tone dripping with mockery. "Yeah, she'll probably talk about surviving in the projects. How many points for tragedy? 5 for tears, 10 for sob stories?" Another girl snorted, adding, "Bet her speech is all about food stamps and hand-me-downs. Classic underdog tale, right?" The chuckles spread like wildfire, drawing glances from parents milling about with their coffee cups and programs. A couple of adults nearby turned their heads, eyebrows raised, but no one intervened. One judge, an older man with a clipboard tucked under his arm, paused mid-stride while sipping his latte. He caught my eye for a split second, shook his head slightly as if dismissing the whole scene, and kept walking toward the front row. The indifference stung almost as much as the insults. These were supposed to be educators, arbiters of fairness, yet they let it slide like it was background noise. Heat rushed to my cheeks, a familiar rush that I'd felt 100 times growing up in our neighborhood, where kids from better schools sneered at us during citywide events. It wasn't just anger bubbling inside me, it was the exhaustion of being reduced to a stereotype before I even opened my mouth. My fingers tightened around the notebook, the edges digging into my palms, but I held steady. These weren't new wounds, they were scars I'd carried from playground taunts to classroom dismissals. Claire's smirk widened, expecting a reaction, a flare-up that would prove her point. But I knew better. Responding now would only feed their narrative, turning me into the angry black girl they wanted to see. Instead, I drew in a slow breath, letting the moment stretch, the laughter fading awkwardly as eyes lingered on us. I didn't snap back. My lips stayed sealed, and I let the silence stretch between us like an invisible barrier. Instead, I slowly closed my notebook, the soft thud of the pages meeting echoing only in my ears amid their fading snickers. My fingers curled around the worn pen in my pocket, its tip blunted from countless revisions, and I squeezed it just enough to ground myself. Mom's voice echoed in my mind, "Words are weapons, Amara, but timing is the trigger." I wasn't about to fire prematurely, not here, not with so many eyes watching for me to crumble. Claire's smirk lingered, her posture expectant, as if daring me to explode and confirm every bias she'd thrown my way. But I lifted my chin steadily, meeting her gaze head-on. My eyes held no rage, no tremor of intimidation, just a calm, unwavering depth that seemed to unsettle her. For a split second, her expression faltered, the corners of her mouth twitched downward, and she blinked rapidly, like she'd glimpsed something unexpected in my composure. The group's laughter died completely then, replaced by an awkward shuffle of feet and averted glances. One of her friends cleared his throat, murmuring something inaudible, but Claire didn't respond. She just stood there, frozen in that moment of disconnection. I turned away without a word, my steps measured as I moved toward the row of seats designated for contestants. The hall's chatter resumed around me, but it felt distant, muffled by the resolve building inside. I didn't glance back at them, not out of fear, but because I refused to give their pettiness more power. Sliding into my assigned chair, I smoothed my skirt and placed the notebook on my lap, feeling the slight crinkle of the folded paper in my shirt pocket. It was my speech, scribbled late last night under that flickering bulb, lines etched with the weight of every slight I'd endured. Not just today's barbs, but years of being overlooked in classes, dismissed in group projects, or stared at in stores. This page wasn't revenge, it was my anchor, a reminder that my voice carried truths they couldn't belittle forever. As I sat there, the announcements droned on, calling the first speakers. My pulse steadied, transforming that initial sting into fuel. They saw a girl from the suburbs, but soon, they'd hear the debater who'd clawed her way to nationals. For now, though, I waited, patient, poised, ready to let my actions speak louder than their insults ever could. The competition kicked off with a round of introductions, the MC's voice booming through the speakers as he listed names and schools. When he reached mine, he hesitated, drawing out Amara Lewis from Franklin High as if the words carried some unspoken apology. The room shifted subtly, whispers rippled from the back rows, and I caught snippets from a cluster of parents perched higher up, their designer coats draped over seats. One woman, her pearls glinting under the lights, leaned toward her companion and murmured just loud enough for the echo to reach me, "They're letting anyone compete these days, aren't they? Doesn't that dilute the whole thing?" A teacher from another district, seated a few rows ahead, let out a soft chuckle, her words slicing through the air like casual barbs, probably handing out participation points for background stories. "You know, to make it inclusive." Her colleague nodded, adding in a hushed tone that still carried, "Exactly. Effort counts for something when you're from a place like that." Their dismissal hung there, unchallenged, blending into the general hum of pre-event chatter. It wasn't overt hostility, but the kind that eroded you slowly, like sandpaper on skin. I sat rigid in my chair, forcing my breathing to stay even, reminding myself that this was their game, underestimating voices they deemed lesser. Claire, lounging in her spot with her entourage, glanced my way again, her lips curling into that signature sneer. She didn't bother lowering her volume as she quipped to her friends, "Hang in there, girl. At least there's always the most improved award or whatever they call it for tries." Her crew tittered, one girl fanning herself with her program as if the idea was too amusing to contain. The comment landed like a pebble in a pond, sending ripples of agreement through nearby spectators. A few heads turned toward me, eyes appraising, then dismissing. No one stepped in to counter it, the adults nearby just shifted uncomfortably or pretended to check their phones. That indifference fueled a quiet fire in my chest, not explosive, but steady, like embers waiting for oxygen. I'd faced this before, in hallways where kids from upscale neighborhoods avoided eye contact, or in classes where my questions were met with patronizing smiles. But today, it sharpened my focus. As the MC moved on to the next name, I traced a finger over my notebook's cover, feeling the faint indentations of my revisions. Their words were noise, my preparation was armor. I kept my gaze fixed on the stage, ignoring the undercurrents swirling around me. The MC, a middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit, adjusted his microphone and turned his attention my way during the introductory Q&A segment. His question came out polished but laced with that subtle pity I'd grown accustomed to. "Amara, how does it feel to be the only contestant from Franklin High?" The room quieted just enough for his words to hang, amplifying the unspoken implication that my presence was an anomaly, a token nod to diversity. Whispers from the audience prickled my skin, but I didn't flinch. I rose slightly in my seat, my voice emerging clear and firm, without a hint of defensiveness. "I believe anyone handed a microphone has earned the chance to speak their truth, no matter where they're from." It was simple, direct, a gentle nudge rather than a shove. I didn't elaborate or justify, I let the statement stand on its own merit. For a beat, the hall absorbed it, then the reactions trickled in. A sharp sniff came from behind, followed by a muffled scoff. One of the other contestants, a boy from a magnet school, shook his head slowly, his whisper carrying to those nearby, "Who does she think she is? Acting like she's on equal footing." The comment sparked a few nods and eye rolls from the Gates crowd. Claire leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with exaggerated poise, her expression a mask of feigned boredom. But I caught the flicker in her eyes, a brief tightening, as if my response had poked at her carefully constructed superiority. A parent nearby muttered to her spouse, "Bold for someone from that side of town." Their tones weren't outright hostile, but they carried that familiar condescension, the kind that dismissed you before you could fully articulate. Inside, a quiet resolve solidified. Their skepticism didn't rattle me, it honed my edge. I'd spent months dissecting arguments, drawing from real-world cases like education equity lawsuits and community reform initiatives. This wasn't bravado, it was preparation meeting opportunity. As the MC moved on to the next query, I settled back, my hands steady on my lap. Their doubts were fuel, transforming the pressure into precision. I wasn't here to beg for validation, I was here to demonstrate it, one measured word at a time. The stage lights seemed brighter now, illuminating not just the podium, but the path I'd carved to reach it. As I eased back into my seat, the MC's voice faded into the background, transitioning to the next contestant. My response still lingered in the air, met with those scattered scoffs and skeptical glances, but I focused on the podium ahead, visualizing my delivery. That's when I caught a murmur from a few rows behind, a low, deliberate exchange that cut through the ambient noise. It was Mr. Malcolm, an veteran educator from another public institution, his salt and pepper hair catching the light as he leaned toward his colleague. He held a sheaf of papers, what looked like copies of preliminary submissions, his finger tapping one page emphatically. "Look at this," he said in a hushed baritone, just audible over the shuffling programs. "That girl's arguments are razor-sharp. I graded this entry myself, flawless structure, backed by precedents I haven't seen teens reference in years. No fluff, just precision." His companion, a woman with wire-rimmed glasses, arched an eyebrow and peered over. "The braided one? From Franklin?" Mr. Malcolm nodded, his expression a mix of admiration and foresight. "Exactly. I have no clue who's coaching her, but mark my words, if the others slack off today, assuming an easy win, they'll carry this lesson home. She's not here to participate, she's built to dominate." The words landed on me like an unexpected ally in a battlefield of foes. I didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it overtly, but a subtle warmth spread through my chest, easing the knot of isolation. It wasn't validation I sought, but hearing someone recognize the hours I'd poured into research, the library sessions after school, dissecting Supreme Court rulings on equity, weaving in stats from policy reports, felt like a quiet affirmation. Mr. Malcolm wasn't just any observer, he'd judged these events for decades, and his insight pierced the veil of prejudice hanging over the room. For a moment, the hall's dynamics shifted in my mind. The gate students' whispers, the parents' sidelong looks, they paled against this glimpse of genuine respect. It fueled me, transforming their underestimation into my advantage. I traced the edge of my notebook again, feeling the texture of my preparations. This strange detail, overheard by chance, wasn't coincidence, it was a spark, reminding me that merit could shine through the noise. As the first speaker took the stage, I sat taller, ready for whatever came next. The spotlight sharpened on the podium as Claire's name echoed through the speakers. She sauntered up with effortless grace, her heels clicking against the polished floor, radiating the kind of assurance that came from years of unchallenged advantage. The audience from the private school sections leaned forward, already primed for her performance. She adjusted the microphone with a practiced flick, her smile beaming like a campaign poster, and launched into her address without missing a beat. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth and modulated, trained for auditoriums like this. "Today, we discuss societal issues through lenses sharpened by rigorous education and structured environments. True leadership in debate emerges from those who've navigated systems designed for excellence, not from personal hardships that cloud objectivity." Her eyes swept the room, pausing deliberately on me for a fraction too long, her implication crystal clear. It wasn't subtle, it was a veiled thrust, framing my background as a liability rather than a strength. Applause erupted from her supporters, sharp and enthusiastic, with one enthusiast even letting out a whistle that pierced the air. Murmurs followed from the back. "Spot on, she's calling it like it is," someone said, their voice carrying just far enough. Another added, "No room for pity points in real discourse." The energy in the hall thickened, charged with that undercurrent of exclusion, as if her words had drawn an invisible line dividing us from them. Heads nodded in agreement from the affluent rows, their expressions smug, validating her every syllable. My blood surged, a hot wave coursing through my veins, but I clamped down on it, my jaw set firm. This wasn't mere commentary, it was escalation, a deliberate escalation aimed at undermining me before I even stepped forward. I'd anticipated jabs, but hearing her twist privilege into a virtue while dismissing lived experiences as clouds ignited a controlled fury within. Still, I remained motionless, my exterior a mask of serenity. Reacting now would play into her hands, turning the narrative against me. Instead, I observed, the way her gestures emphasized her points, the confident tilt of her chin, the way the crowd fed off her charisma. The tension coiled tighter, like a spring compressed to its limit, the entire space humming with anticipation of what might snap next. I exhaled slowly, channeling that pressure into clarity, knowing my turn would redefine the boundaries she'd just drawn. I held my ground, my posture unchanged as Claire wrapped up her delivery with a flourish, basking in the wave of approval from her corner of the auditorium. The claps tapered off, leaving a charged hush, but I sensed the undercurrents shifting like shadows lengthening at dusk. Whispers began to weave through the crowd, not the derisive kind I'd endured earlier, but laced with a hint of uncertainty. From the judge's table, an elderly professor, his face lined with decades of academic scrutiny, leaned toward Mr. Malcolm, his voice a confidential murmur that floated just within earshot. "That young lady over there," he said, nodding subtly in my direction, "she seems to be holding back the most profound insights for the finale." Mr. Malcolm inclined his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Precisely. She won't resort to theatrics or outbursts. No, she'll append the entire framework with elegance." Their exchange hung in my thoughts like a lifeline, unspoken support amid the sea of skepticism. It wasn't eavesdropping that brought it to me. The hall's acoustics amplified quiet confidences, especially in these pregnant pauses between speakers. My chest expanded with a subtle breath, the words bolstering the foundation I'd built through solitary study sessions, poring over legal texts and societal analyses until dawn. This wasn't pity, it was recognition of substance, the kind I'd rarely encountered in environments dominated by privilege. Further back, a cluster of students from neutral schools started to take notice, their heads turning toward me, the unassuming figure in the plain blouse, braids pulled tight, shoes bearing the marks of daily wear. A lanky boy in a hoodie leaned toward his friend, his tone laced with intrigue rather than mockery. "She hasn't uttered more than a sentence yet. But something's off, I'm starting to get nervous for Claire." "That calm vibe? It's unnerving." His companion glanced my way, eyebrows knitting. "Yeah, it's like she's got an ace hidden. No notes, no fidgeting. What's her deal?" The observations rippled outward, diluting the earlier confidence of the elite group. I didn't smile or acknowledge them, instead, I absorbed the change, letting it fortify my core. Their growing doubt mirrored my inner certainty, forged from triumphs like last year's national mock trial victory, a secret I'd kept to avoid preconceptions. As the MC announced the next participant, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation, the balance tipping ever so slightly. I was no longer just an outlier, I was an enigma, poised to unravel their assumptions. I ascended the steps to the podium, my footsteps deliberate and unhurried, the wood creaking faintly under my weight. The auditorium's hush deepened, a collective inhale as eyes fixed on me, the outsider in modest attire, no entourage, no visible props. I carried nothing but the weight of my experiences, etched into memory from endless rehearsals in our dim living room, where echoes of distant sirens often punctuated my practice. The microphone loomed, cold and metallic, but I met it without hesitation, adjusting it slightly to my height. No elaborate greeting escaped my lips. I scanned the judges first, then the crowd, my tone emerging steady and resonant, slicing through the expectant quiet. "I hail from a community where subsidized meals might be the sole incentive drawing kids to school each day. Yet if you assume that diminishes my perspective, then today's insights aren't meant for you." The declaration landed like a stone in still water, ripples of silence spreading outward. No immediate applause, no murmurs, just a profound void, as if the room had collectively forgotten to breathe. A contestant's pen slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor, the sound amplified in the vacuum. Judges leaned forward, one removing his spectacles slowly, his brow furrowed in contemplation. Parents who moments ago nodded at Claire's assertions now sat rigid, their expressions a blend of surprise and re-evaluation. Down below, Claire's composure cracked, her eyes widened, lips parting in a silent gasp, her earlier assurance evaporating like mist under sunlight. She shifted in her chair, fingers twisting the edge of her notes, the color draining from her cheeks. A nearby student froze mid-note, his gaze darting between us, while another whispered faintly to a peer, the words lost in the stillness. In that suspended instant, a surge of clarity washed over me, not triumph, but vindication. This wasn't scripted flair, it was authenticity distilled from realities they'd never faced, classrooms with outdated textbooks, neighborhoods scarred by inequality, yet brimming with untold resilience. My pulse thrummed steadily, the quiet affirming what I'd long known: truth didn't need volume to command attention. It simply required delivery. As the seconds stretched, the atmosphere transformed, heavy with the unspoken realization that the underdog had just redefined the arena. I paused, letting the impact settle, before proceeding into the heart of my argument. After that opening line hung in the air, I dove straight into the core of my presentation, my voice gaining momentum like a river breaking free. I laid out arguments with surgical accuracy, drawing from landmark court cases on school funding disparities, citing statistics from Harvard's Social Research Institute that highlighted how under-resourced districts perpetuated cycles of inequality. I dissected policies like the No Child Left Behind Act, weaving in analyses of recent reforms that failed marginalized communities, all without glancing at a single note. Each point built on the last, exposing the flaws in systems that favored the affluent while sidelining voices like mine. The words flowed from deep within, forged in those quiet hours dissecting reports on educational equity, challenging assumptions that privilege equated to merit. My team advisor, Mr. Ellis, a middle-aged man who'd remained subdued throughout the preliminaries, now straightened in his seat, his nods becoming more vigorous with every reference I dropped. His eyes widened at my breakdown of resource allocation models, as if witnessing a revelation. A judge at the panel's edge, a woman with silver streaks in her hair, leaned forward and exclaimed under her breath, loud enough for the front rows to catch, "I've never encountered a high schooler dissecting the 1974 Balanced Education Act with such depth. It's masterful." The head judge, Professor Harlan, a retired law scholar with a reputation for unyielding standards, removed his reading glasses deliberately, folding them with care. He turned to his fellow panelists, his whisper carrying an air of astonishment, "This transcends a mere contest. It's akin to a courtroom proceeding, with evidence presented impeccably." Their reactions fueled me further, a subtle current of affirmation amid the earlier skepticism. I pressed on, incorporating data from urban policy studies, illustrating how socioeconomic barriers stifled potential in schools like mine. The auditorium's energy evolved, scattered coughs ceased, and fidgeting stopped. Even skeptics from the private academies sat motionless, their earlier complacency giving way to rapt attention. Mr. Ellis caught my eye briefly, his expression a mix of pride and surprise, as though he'd underestimated the full extent of my preparation. Professor Harlan jotted notes furiously, occasionally glancing up with a furrowed brow that spoke of genuine engagement. As I transitioned to my closing points, emphasizing actionable reforms for inclusive curricula, the panel's murmurs grew. Another judge muttered, "She's not just debating, she's advocating with the precision of a seasoned attorney." Their emerging respect validated the sacrifices, the skipped meals for study time, the borrowed library access after hours. I felt the tide turning, not through confrontation, but through irrefutable logic, setting the stage for what would follow. As I wrapped up my final point, emphasizing the urgent need for equitable funding models to bridge educational divides, I let the last syllable resonate. No dramatic flourish, no plea for applause, I simply inclined my head slightly and stepped away from the podium, my movements as composed as when I'd begun. The auditorium plunged into a profound stillness, the kind that follows a revelation too potent for immediate reaction. Chairs creaked faintly as people shifted, but no hands came together. It was as if the weight of my delivery had pinned everyone in place, forcing them to absorb the implications. Professor Harlan, the lead judge, rose from his seat with deliberate poise, grasping the microphone. His voice boomed across the space, cutting through the suspended tension. "Before we proceed to scoring summaries, there's something essential to share. The speaker who just addressed us represents John Lewis High School, and she is none other than the reigning champion of the National Youth Mock Trial Academy from last year." A collective gasp swept the room, air rushing back in like a tide. Whispers erupted in fragments. Champion? National level? The revelation hung there, transforming the earlier quiet into a buzz of astonishment. I stood at the edge of the stage, my expression neutral, feeling the shift ripple outward. Parents who dismissed me earlier now craned their necks, murmuring in hushed awe. Mr. Ellis, my advisor, beamed openly, his earlier restraint giving way to evident pride. Claire, rooted in her chair below, went rigid, her face paling as the words sank in. Her notes slipped from her fingers, fluttering unnoticed to the floor. Beside her, a fellow Gates student leaned close, his voice a stunned hiss. "Wait, does that mean she's a national winner?" The hall held its breath, the air thick with re-evaluation. Judges exchanged glances, one nodding affirmatively as if confirming a long-suspected truth. Students from various schools stared openly, their earlier skepticism fracturing into fragments of respect. Even the MC fumbled his cue cards, momentarily off balance. For me, This unveiling wasn't a triumph to savor outwardly, it was the culmination of concealed efforts, the mock trials I'd dominated in regional circuits, the scholarships I'd quietly secured, all while navigating a world that rarely spotlighted girls like me. The disclosure peeled back layers, exposing not just my credentials, but the systemic oversights that had fueled the day's tensions. As the murmurs swelled, Professor Harlan continued, "Her track record speaks volumes, and today's performance only reinforces it." I descended the steps, the spotlight fading behind me, but the impact lingered, reshaping perceptions in its wake. The competition's dynamics had irrevocably altered, my hidden prowess now the centerpiece. Claire lurched to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor in the stunned silence that followed Professor Harlan's announcement. She took a faltering step forward, as if drawn by some invisible force, but halted abruptly, her balance teetering. Her face, once a portrait of unshakable confidence, now crumpled, eyes wide with disbelief, cheeks flushed a deep crimson. The program in her hand crumpled as her fingers clenched involuntarily, and her lips trembled, parting as if to speak but producing only a faint, breathless gasp. The room's collective gaze swung toward her, amplifying her isolation in that moment of unraveling. I watched from the stage's edge, my stance unchanged, feeling no surge of vindictive pleasure, only a quiet acknowledgement of the inevitable. She'd built her fortress on assumptions, and now the foundations cracked under the truth. Whispers crested like waves, "She had no idea," someone muttered. "Talk about a plot twist." Her friends from Gates exchanged uneasy glances, one girl reaching out tentatively, but Claire shrugged her off, her shoulders hunching as reality settled in. The MC cleared his throat, his voice amplified to regain control. "If the top two finalists, Claire from Gates Academy and Amara from John Lewis High, could please join us on stage for the final tally." The invitation hung there, polite yet insistent. Claire hesitated, her legs seeming rooted, then shuffled forward with mechanical steps, her heels dragging now instead of clicking. As she ascended the short stairs, our paths crossed briefly. She paused inches away, her breath ragged, and finally found her voice in a whisper that cracked, I had no clue. I just assumed." Her words trailed off, incomplete, laced with a vulnerability she'd never shown before. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but a fracture in her armor, exposing the fragility beneath her earlier arrogance. I met her eyes steadily, my expression devoid of triumph or resentment, just a serene neutrality that conveyed more than any retort could. It was as if to say, without utterance, "And now the veil lifts." She averted her gaze first, swallowing hard, her hands twisting at her sides. Professor Harlan proceeded with the scores, his tone measured, with unanimous agreement from the panel. Amara Lewis secures victory by a commanding margin, exceptional clarity, evidence depth, and persuasive force. Applause thundered then, genuine and resounding, from corners that had once been skeptical. Claire stood beside me, her posture deflated, accepting the runner-up nod with a numb nod. In that instant, I felt the equilibrium restore, not through confrontation, but revelation. Her collapse wasn't my doing, it was the consequence of her own blindness, now illuminated for all to see. As we descended, the crowd's energy pulsed with newfound respect, marking the end of her reign and the dawn of acknowledgement. Following Professor Harlan's declaration, the auditorium erupted in thunderous ovation, hands clapping in waves that built to a crescendo. Cheers mingled with whistles from unexpected quarters, students who'd eyed me warily now stood, their faces alight with surprise. Judges nodded approvingly, and Mr. Ellis pumped his fist subtly from his seat. But I merely dipped my chin in acknowledgement, a brief gesture of gratitude, before descending the steps as if this were merely the close of another class period. The victory pulsed through me, not as euphoria, but as quiet confirmation, the hours of solitary preparation, the barriers I'd dismantled, all crystallized in this outcome. I moved through the aisle with steady strides, the crowd parting slightly as murmurs followed. Incredible turnaround, someone breathed. She owned that stage. My focus remained inward, savoring the shift from outsider to exemplar, yet untouched by arrogance. As I approached Claire's row, our paths intersected once more. She rose unsteadily, her earlier poise shattered, now replaced by a hunched vulnerability. Her eyes met mine fleetingly, then dropped to the floor, her hands clasped tightly as if anchoring herself. No words passed between us, no accusations, no concessions. My gaze held steady, conveying neither scorn nor pity, just an unspoken equilibrium restored. She averted her face, a subtle nod of concession, her expression mingling regret with reluctant admiration, as if glimpsing the depths she'd overlooked. Outside the hall, the corridor buzzed with post-event chatter, groups dissecting the results. I retrieved my jacket from the coat rack, slinging my plain canvas bag over one shoulder, the same one that carried my books through crowded bus rides home. A few onlookers trailed my progress, their stares lingering with curiosity, but none approached. One judge paused nearby, offering a quick handshake. "You've set a new benchmark, young lady." I thanked him softly, then pushed through the double doors into the crisp evening air. The parking lot stretched before me, cars gleaming under street lamps, a stark contrast to the humility of my journey here. No fanfare awaited, no waiting family or friends with banners. Just the familiar solitude that had shaped me, now laced with accomplishment. As I walked toward the bus stop, footsteps echoed behind, but they halted short. I didn't turn, I knew the stairs carried respect now, not dismissal. This departure wasn't escape, it was evolution, leaving behind a space forever altered by my presence. The night enveloped me, cool and promising, as I boarded the bus, the victory settling like a well-earned calm. Mr. Tate, the esteemed professor emeritus from the local law school, became an unexpected voice in the aftermath. I learned about it a few days later, scrolling through my phone during a quiet evening at home. A local news clip popped up in my feed, featuring him in a post-event interview, his silver hair neatly combed, suit impeccable against the backdrop of the auditorium's fading lights. The reporter, microphone thrust forward, asked about standout moments from the finals. He paused thoughtfully, his eyes reflecting a depth earned from years in lecture halls. "I've instructed undergraduates at Harvard," he stated, his tone measured yet fervent. "Elite minds, sharp and ambitious. Yet today, I absorbed a profound teaching from a high school junior." Her poise amid provocation, it's the essence those in authority must master foremost. Not dominance through volume, but influence via restraint and intellect. The words struck me deeply, not as flattery, but as echoes of my own ethos. I'd never sought praise from figures like him, my drive stemmed from proving possibilities to kids in neighborhoods mirroring mine. The clip garnered views rapidly, comments flooding in, inspirational, game changer. It spread like digital wildfire, shared across platforms by educators and activists alike. Soon after, footage of my speech surfaced online, uploaded by an attendee with a smartphone. The title blared, "Black Teen Turns Mockery into Historic Lesson." It captured everything, the initial tension, my steady ascent, the pivotal opener that silenced the space. View counts climbed into the thousands overnight, then tens of thousands. Hashtags emerged organically, #RespectAmara trended swiftly, amassing posts from strangers recounting similar encounters with bias, praising the turnaround as a beacon for underrepresented youth. I watched it unfold from my bedroom, the screen's glow illuminating posters of civil rights icons on my walls. Messages poured in, peers from Franklin High cheering, even a few from Gates offering belated congratulations. One from Claire appeared in my inbox, terse but sincere, "You deserved it. Sorry for before." I didn't reply immediately, forgiveness required reflection. Instead, I pondered Mr. Tate's insight, how it amplified my message beyond the event. This wasn't personal glory, it was a ripple effect, challenging norms in classrooms and beyond. As the trend peaked, news outlets picked it up, framing it as a story of resilience against elitism. In that viral surge, I saw my journey mirrored, solitary struggles yielding collective awakening. A month later, I wandered the hallways of John Lewis High during lunch break, the familiar clamor of lockers slamming and chatter filling the air. The bulletin board near the main office caught my eye, usually cluttered with flyers for club meetings and bake sales, but today, something new dominated the center. Pinned prominently was a photograph from that fateful debate day, me at the podium, eyes locked forward, hands empty yet commanding the space. The image captured the hush that had fallen over the crowd, my figure small but unyielding against the vast backdrop of the stage. No filters, no edits, just the raw moment, printed on glossy paper that gleamed under the fluorescent bulbs. Beneath it, in bold marker strokes from Principal Ramirez's hand, ran an inscription, "No need to shout to silence a room. Sometimes, truth alone compels the world to listen." The words struck me like a gentle echo, resonating with the core of what I'd embodied that afternoon. I stood there, tracing the letters with my fingertip, feeling a swell of quiet reflection. This wasn't mere decoration, it was a testament, a subtle nod to how one voice could redefine silence. Students passing by paused, some snapping quick photos on their phones, others murmuring approvals, "That's our girl," or "Changed the game." The board had become a focal point, drawing clusters of underclassmen who'd heard the tales. One freshman, wide-eyed, approached me hesitantly, "Is that really you? The one who shut down the elites?" I nodded, offering a small smile. It was just speaking my mind. But inside, I knew it ran deeper, the culmination of barriers breached, assumptions shattered. That photo symbolized more than personal achievement. It represented possibility for every kid in halls like these, where dreams often battled against stacked odds. As I walked away, the inscription lingered in my thoughts, a mantra for future hurdles. It wasn't about glory or retribution, it was the enduring power of authenticity. In that simple display, my story had woven into the school's fabric, inspiring whispers of ambition among peers who'd once doubted their own reach. The world hadn't transformed overnight, but in this corner, truth had indeed commanded attention, leaving an indelible mark that echoed far beyond the frame.